When I first met Mark, I thought I'd struck gold. He was the kind of man every woman dreams about, steady, hard-working, and kind. His laugh was infectious, his presence grounding, and when he looked at me, I felt like I was the center of his universe. We fell in love fast, married within 2 years, and by our 3rd anniversary, we had our first child, a little boy who had Mark's bright blue eyes. Life was good, better than good, really. Mark was a devoted father, the kind who got down on the floor to build block towers and read bedtime stories in all the silly voices. When our daughter came along 2 years later, I thought our family was complete, and I couldn't imagine anything tearing us apart. But as the years went by, cracks started to show in the life we'd built. Mark worked long hours at the construction company, a job that demanded physical labor and unrelenting deadlines. He'd come home exhausted, his body aching and his temper frayed. At first, he'd unwind with a single beer in front of the TV, and I didn't think much of it. He deserves it, I told myself. He works so hard. But one beer turned into 2, then 3, and soon it wasn't just evenings, it was weekends, holidays, and any spare moment he could find. The drinking wasn't the only issue, but it was the spark that ignited so many of our arguments. I tried to talk to him about it early on, gently suggesting that maybe he didn't need that second drink or that he could take a break for a week. "I'm fine, Laura," he'd say, brushing me off. "It's just a couple of beers." But it wasn't fine. The man I'd married, the one who laughed easily and planned spontaneous family outings, was disappearing. He became irritable, snapping at the kids for leaving toys in the hallway or forgetting to do their chores. And when I tried to step in, we'd end up in shouting matches that left both of us drained and resentful. I hated how the fights felt inevitable, like some cruel ritual we couldn't escape. The worst part was that the kids started noticing. Our oldest, just 9 at the time, would pull his younger sister into their room whenever the yelling started. One night, after Mark came home late from the bar, stumbling and slurring his words, our son whispered, "Mom, is Dad okay?" His small voice broke something in me. I didn't leave right away. I told myself things would get better, that Mark just needed time to adjust or that he'd snap out of it once he saw what it was doing to our family. I believed him when he promised to cut back or swore he'd stop altogether. But promises only go so far, and each time he broke them, the trust between us eroded a little more. One evening, after yet another fight, I packed a small bag for myself and the kids and drove to my sister's house. Mark called the next morning, his voice raw with regret. "Come home," he begged. "I'll do better. I swear." And for a while, he did. He stayed sober for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month. But then something would happen, a bad day at work, an argument over bills, and the cycle would start again. The night I decided to leave for good, Mark had forgotten about our daughter's school play. She'd spent weeks practicing her lines, so excited to see us in the audience, but when the play started, the seat next to me was empty. He came home hours later, the smell of beer clinging to his clothes, and I knew I couldn't keep pretending things would change. "Mark," I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat, "we're leaving." He didn't argue this time. He just nodded, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I'll miss you," he said quietly, but I couldn't tell if he meant me or the life we'd shared. Moving out was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I found a small apartment not far from the kids' school, just big enough for the 3 of us. The first night there, I lay awake in the dark, listening to the unfamiliar creaks of the new space, wondering if I'd made the right decision. The kids adjusted faster than I did. They missed their dad, of course, but they seemed lighter somehow, as if the weight of our household tension had been lifted. Mark called often, at first just to check on the kids, but then to talk to me. "I'm sorry," he said one night, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I've let you down." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to forgive him, to believe that things could be different, but another part of me was too tired to hope. For months after I left Mark, life settled into a rhythm that felt both comforting and strange. The kids and I built a new routine in our small apartment, a cozy space where their laughter echoed through the walls and the air felt lighter without the tension that had consumed our home before. At first, it was hard to adjust to the silence that came after bedtime, the absence of Mark's voice or the sound of the TV humming in the background. But over time, the quiet started to feel like peace. Mark called regularly, always asking about the kids first, how they were adjusting, how school was going, if they'd said anything about him. I kept my answers short, careful not to give him false hope. "They're doing okay," I'd say, avoiding the deeper conversation that always felt like it was lingering on the edges. But Mark never pushed, never tried to guilt me or demand explanations. Instead, he focused on the kids, showing up for every soccer game, every school event, always on time and always sober. At first, I thought it was an act, a desperate attempt to win me back. But as the weeks turned into months, his consistency surprised me. He didn't just show up, he participated. He cheered louder than any other parent at our son's games, helped our daughter with her science fair project, and even learned to braid her hair for the mornings she stayed with him. The kids began to talk about him differently, with a warmth and pride that had been missing for years. "Daddy's really good at braiding now," our daughter announced one evening, her eyes shining with excitement. "He's been practicing." I smiled, but a pang of something I couldn't quite name settled in my chest, pride, maybe, or regret. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Mark called. His voice was steady, but there was a vulnerability in his tone that caught me off guard. "I've been going to counseling," he said. "It's helping me understand some things about myself, and about us." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to shut the conversation down, to protect the fragile stability I'd built for myself and the kids. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the man I fell in love with, couldn't help but listen. He didn't ask me to come back, didn't try to make promises he couldn't keep. Instead, he said, "I know I've hurt you, Laura. And I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I want to be better, for the kids, and for myself." I didn't believe him right away. I couldn't afford to. But I started to notice the changes. He stopped making excuses, stopped deflecting blame. He owned up to the hurt he'd caused and made a genuine effort to rebuild trust, not just with me, but with the kids too. When our youngest scraped his knee at the park one weekend, Mark was the first to kneel down and comfort him, whispering silly jokes until the tears turned to giggles. Watching him with the kids, I saw glimpses of the man I used to know, the man I thought had been lost to years of stress and drinking. One weekend, Mark suggested a family outing to the zoo, something we hadn't done together in years. I hesitated at first, worried about confusing the kids or reopening old wounds. But when I saw the excitement on their faces, I couldn't say no. The day was surprisingly easy, filled with laughter and shared memories. At one point, as we watched the kids feed the giraffes, Mark turned to me and said, "Thank you for letting me be here today." His sincerity caught me off guard, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the man I'd fallen in love with wasn't gone after all. As the months went on, the changes in Mark became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the fact that he'd stopped drinking, though that alone felt like a miracle. It was the way he carried himself, the way he approached everything with a quiet determination I hadn't seen in years. He didn't just want to be better, he was actively working on it, every single day. He kept going to counseling, even when he didn't feel like it, and he started attending a local support group for people struggling with addiction. He shared bits and pieces of what he was learning with me during our occasional phone calls, but he never pushed for more than I was willing to give. "I'm learning to be present," he said once, his voice thoughtful. "For the kids, for myself, and, well, for you too, if you'll let me." I didn't know how to respond to that. My heart was torn between the life we'd shared and the life I'd started to build without him. The kids, however, had no such hesitation. They were thrilled to see their dad so engaged, so involved. Our daughter, who'd once clung to me during Mark's angry outbursts, now ran to him with open arms whenever he came to pick them up. "Daddy's teaching me how to ride my bike without training wheels," she announced one evening, her face glowing with pride. "He says I'm a natural." Watching them reconnect with their father filled me with a bittersweet mix of emotions. I was happy for them, of course, but I couldn't help but wonder where this version of Mark had been when we were still together. That question lingered in my mind, especially during moments like the one at our son's soccer game, when Mark joined the other parents in a spontaneous cheer that turned into a wave. He caught my eye from across the field and smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that made me catch my breath. One evening, after dropping the kids off at my apartment, Mark lingered at the door. "Can we talk for a minute?" he asked, his tone cautious. I hesitated but nodded, stepping outside so the kids wouldn't overhear. "I just want to say thank you," he began, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "For letting me be part of their lives. I know I don't deserve it after everything I've put you through, but I'm grateful." His words disarmed me. "They need their dad," I said simply. "And they need their mom," he replied, his voice soft. "You've done an incredible job with them, Laura. I don't think I ever told you that enough." For a moment, we just stood there, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. I wanted to tell him how much his words meant to me, how hard it had been to hold everything together after I left, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I nodded and said, "Good night, Mark." But his words stayed with me long after he drove away. A few weeks later, Mark suggested another family outing, this time to a nearby lake. He rented a small rowboat and spent the afternoon teaching the kids how to paddle. I sat on the shore, watching them laugh and splash each other, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of something I couldn't quite name, hope, maybe, or the faintest beginnings of forgiveness. When Mark joined me on the blanket later, his hair still damp from the water, he didn't say anything at first. He just sat beside me, his presence steady and unassuming. Finally, he broke the silence. "I know I hurt you, Laura. And I know I can't erase that. But I want to try to make things right, even if it takes the rest of my life." His words hit me like a wave, crashing over all the walls I'd built around my heart. For the first time, I allowed myself to wonder if reconciliation was possible, not for the sake of the kids, but for us. The day I allowed myself to consider reconciliation with Mark felt like opening a door I'd bolted shut long ago. For months, I'd convinced myself that moving on was the only way forward, that the damage between us was too deep to repair. But watching him with the kids, seeing his genuine effort to change, and hearing the vulnerability in his words had started to chip away at the barriers I'd put up. Still, I was cautious. I didn't want to rush into anything and risk undoing the progress he'd made, or the stability I'd created for myself and the kids. So, when Mark suggested we try spending more time together as a family, I hesitated. "Let's take it slow," I said, my voice uncertain. "For the kids' sake." He nodded, his expression earnest. "Whatever you need, Laura. I'm here." Our first attempt at rebuilding was a simple dinner at my apartment. Mark arrived early, bringing a tray of lasagna he'd made himself, a small but significant gesture, given how he'd rarely cooked during our marriage. The kids were thrilled, chattering away about their day as we sat around the tiny dining table. At one point, our daughter spilled her juice, and Mark jumped up to help her clean it up before I could even react. It was such a small moment, but it struck me how different he was now, more present, more attentive, more patient. After the kids went to bed, Mark lingered for a bit, helping me tidy up the kitchen. We worked in silence at first, but then he spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about what went wrong," he said, his voice steady but soft. "And I know it wasn't just the drinking. I wasn't the husband you needed. I wasn't listening. I wasn't showing up for you the way I should have." His honesty caught me off guard. For so long, I'd carried the weight of our failed marriage as though it was my burden alone, but hearing him take responsibility felt like a balm on an old wound. From there, we began to test the waters of what a renewed relationship might look like. We started small, family game nights, trips to the park, even a Saturday morning spent baking cookies with the kids. The more time we spent together, the more I found myself remembering the reasons I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. He still had that laugh that could light up a room, that steady presence that made everything feel a little less overwhelming. But there was something new about him now, too, a humility and self-awareness that hadn't been there before. One evening, after another family outing, Mark walked me to my door. "I don't want to push you," he said, his hands in his pockets. "But I need you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes, for you, for the kids, for us. Even if it means waiting as long as you need." His words stayed with me, echoing in my mind as I lay awake that night. I couldn't deny that I still had feelings for him, but I also couldn't ignore the fear that came with the possibility of letting him back into my heart. What if he slipped back into old habits? What if we ended up hurting each other all over again? But then I thought about the kids, about how happy they were to see us together again, and about the man Mark was becoming, the man he was working so hard to be. One weekend, we decided to take the kids to the same lake we'd visited a few months earlier, this time with a picnic basket and fishing rods in tow. As we sat on the dock, watching the kids cast their lines into the water, Mark turned to me and said, "I don't want you to say anything right now, but I need to ask, do you think there's a chance for us?" His question hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I didn't answer right away, partly because I didn't know what to say and partly because I was scared of the answer. But as I watched him help our youngest untangle his fishing line, the look of pure joy on their faces, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, the answer could be yes. The more time we spent together as a family, the harder it became to ignore the possibility that Mark and I could rebuild something meaningful. But I was still wary of rushing into anything. Our history was complicated, and the wounds from our past hadn't fully healed. Despite his consistency and the obvious love he had for the kids, I needed to be sure this new version of Mark was here to stay. I focused on observing him, not just how he interacted with the kids but how he handled himself. He continued going to counseling and attending his support group, and he didn't shy away from discussing the work he was doing on himself. "It's not easy," he admitted one evening after he'd dropped the kids off. "Some days, I feel like I'm carrying around all the mistakes I've ever made. But then I remind myself why I'm doing this, for them, and for you." His honesty caught me off guard, but it also chipped away at the wall I'd built around my heart. The kids were thriving in the midst of all this change. Our daughter, once so cautious around her dad, now clung to him during their time together, her giggles filling the air whenever he tossed her in the air or chased her around the park. Our oldest, who'd grown quiet and withdrawn during the peak of Mark's drinking, had begun to open up again, sharing stories about his school friends and asking for help with his math homework. Watching them bond with their father brought me a bittersweet sense of joy. I was happy for them, of course, but it also forced me to confront the memories of the years we'd lost to Mark's drinking. One evening, Mark asked if we could talk after the kids went to bed. I hesitated, unsure of what he wanted to say, but eventually, I agreed. We sat on the porch of my apartment, the cool night air wrapping around us. "Laura," he began, his voice steady, "I know I've hurt you in ways I can never fully make up for. And I know I don't have the right to ask for anything from you. But I need to say this, I still love you. I've never stopped loving you." His words hit me like a wave, bringing a flood of emotions I wasn't prepared for. I wanted to tell him I loved him too, that I always had, but the fear of opening myself up to more pain kept me silent. Instead, I said, "Mark, this isn't just about love. It's about trust. And that's not something I can rebuild overnight." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I understand," he said. "I just needed you to know how I feel." After that conversation, I found myself thinking about Mark more and more, not just the man he was now but the man he'd been when we first fell in love. I remembered the way he used to surprise me with flowers for no reason, the way he'd hold my hand during long car rides, the way he'd look at me like I was the most important person in the world. Those memories had been buried under years of anger and disappointment, but now they were beginning to resurface. The turning point came during a family trip to the beach. Mark had suggested it as a way to celebrate our youngest's birthday, and I'd agreed, mostly for the kids' sake. But as we built sandcastles together, splashed in the waves, and shared a picnic on the shore, I realized how much I missed having Mark by my side. He wasn't just a good father, he was becoming the partner I'd always hoped he could be. That evening, as the kids roasted marshmallows over a small bonfire, Mark sat beside me, his gaze focused on the flickering flames. "I know we're not there yet," he said quietly. "But do you think we could ever be a family again?" His question hung in the air, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to pull away. Instead, I nodded slowly. "Maybe," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But it's going to take time." Mark didn't push for more. He simply smiled, a soft, hopeful expression that made my heart ache in the best way. Over the next few weeks, we continued to spend time together, slowly rebuilding the foundation of our relationship. It wasn't always easy, there were moments of doubt, moments when the scars of our past threatened to reopen, but we faced them together, with honesty and patience. One evening, as I tucked the kids into bed, our daughter asked, "Mom, does this mean Daddy's coming home?" Her question caught me off guard, but instead of brushing it off, I sat down beside her and said, "We're still figuring things out, sweetheart. But no matter what, we'll always be a family." She nodded, satisfied with my answer, and I couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, we were on the right path. The slow process of rebuilding my relationship with Mark felt like learning to walk again after years of standing still. Each step was cautious, deliberate, and tinged with uncertainty, but as time passed, the trust between us began to grow. Mark continued to show up, not just for the kids but for me too, in ways that reminded me of the man I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. He was present, attentive, and thoughtful in ways I hadn't experienced since the early days of our marriage. He'd show up at my door with a coffee just the way I liked it, or he'd send a quick text asking how my day was going. These small gestures, while seemingly insignificant, spoke volumes about the effort he was making to repair what had been broken. One evening, Mark suggested we go out for dinner, just the two of us. The idea made me nervous, but the thought of reconnecting with him outside the context of parenting felt important. We chose a quiet little Italian place downtown, the kind of restaurant we used to visit before life became a whirlwind of diapers, homework, and stress. Sitting across from him at the candlelit table felt surreal, like stepping back in time. For the first few minutes, we fumbled through small talk, both of us unsure how to navigate the moment. But then Mark smiled, that same boyish grin I hadn't seen in years, and said, "Do you remember the last time we came here? You ordered spaghetti and almost knocked over your wine glass with the fork." I laughed, the memory coming back in a rush, and suddenly the awkwardness melted away. We talked for hours that night, reminiscing about the good times and acknowledging the challenges we'd faced. When he walked me to my door afterward, he didn't push for anything more than a simple hug, and that restraint made me respect him even more. The kids, meanwhile, were thriving. They'd always loved their dad, but now they seemed to light up around him in a way that filled me with both pride and a pang of regret for the years we'd lost. Our daughter began drawing pictures of the four of us together, labeling them "my family," and our son often asked Mark for advice on everything from soccer drills to science projects. Seeing their bond with him strengthen made me realize how much they'd missed having him fully present in their lives. It also reminded me of what we'd been fighting for, not just a second chance at love, but the chance to give our kids the family they deserved. But rebuilding wasn't without its challenges. There were moments when old insecurities crept in, moments when I wondered if we were moving too fast or setting ourselves up for disappointment. One evening, after a particularly stressful day, I found myself snapping at Mark over something trivial. "You don't have to try so hard all the time," I said sharply, immediately regretting the words as they left my mouth. Instead of getting defensive, Mark simply nodded. "I know," he said quietly. "But I want to." His response disarmed me, and I realized how far we'd both come, how much we'd learned about navigating conflict without letting it consume us. As we approached the 1-year mark since I'd left, Mark suggested we take the kids on a weekend getaway to the mountains. "No pressure," he said. "Just a chance for us to spend time together as a family." I agreed, and the trip turned out to be one of the most meaningful experiences we'd shared in years. We hiked trails surrounded by golden leaves, roasted marshmallows under a sky full of stars, and played board games in the cozy cabin we'd rented. On the last night, as the kids slept soundly in their bunk beds, Mark and I sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the crisp autumn air. "Laura," he said, his voice steady, "I don't know where this is going, but I want you to know that I'm in this for the long haul. Whatever it takes, I'm here." His words stayed with me as we drove home the next day, the kids chattering in the back seat about their favorite parts of the trip. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what it might look like to truly start over with Mark, not as the people we used to be, but as the people we'd become. That evening, as I tucked the kids into bed, I sat with our daughter for a moment, stroking her hair as she drifted off to sleep. "Mom," she murmured, her voice thick with drowsiness, "I'm glad Daddy's back." Her simple statement brought tears to my eyes, and I realized that maybe I was too. The turning point in my relationship with Mark came one quiet evening after the kids had gone to bed. We were sitting on the couch in my apartment, talking about the logistics of the upcoming week, school projects, soccer games, and a dentist appointment, when he suddenly paused and looked at me. "Laura," he said, his voice steady but soft, "I need to ask you something." I braced myself, unsure of what was coming. "Do you think we could try again? Not just for the kids, but for us?" His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I looked at him, taking in the vulnerability etched into his face. He wasn't pleading or pressuring, he was simply asking, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to pull away. "I think we can try," I said cautiously. "But it's going to take time, and it's not going to be easy." Mark nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "I'm not looking for easy," he said. "I'm looking for real." From that moment, we began to navigate what it meant to rebuild a relationship from the ground up. It wasn't the dramatic, sweeping reconciliation I'd seen in movies or read about in books, it was quiet and intentional, filled with small steps that slowly brought us closer together. We started spending more time together, not just as parents but as two people rediscovering the bond we once had. He came over for dinner more often, staying late to help with the dishes and play board games with the kids. On weekends, we'd take family outings, trips to the park, hikes in the woods, or lazy afternoons at the lake. Each moment felt like a thread, weaving us back together in a way that felt stronger than before. But it wasn't without its challenges. There were moments when old wounds resurfaced, when a thoughtless comment or a stressful day would bring back memories of the pain we'd caused each other. One evening, after a minor disagreement about the kids' bedtime routines, I found myself retreating into silence, the familiar walls around my heart threatening to rise again. Mark noticed immediately. "Talk to me," he said gently. "Don't shut me out." His patience surprised me, and instead of pushing him away, I found myself opening up about my fears. "I'm scared," I admitted. "Scared that we're going to fall back into old patterns, that we'll hurt each other again." Mark reached for my hand, his grip firm but comforting. "We're not the same people we were back then," he said. "And if we've learned anything, it's how to do better. I'm not going to let us go back to that place." His reassurance gave me the strength to keep moving forward, and over time, those moments of doubt became less frequent. We celebrated small victories, navigating a tough co-parenting decision without arguing, surviving a chaotic holiday dinner with the kids, or simply enjoying a quiet evening together without the weight of the past hanging over us. The kids, too, seemed to thrive in this new dynamic. They laughed more, fought less, and began to talk about when Daddy moves back in with an ease that tugged at my heartstrings. The question of Mark moving back home became inevitable, though we both approached it cautiously. I don't want to rush this, I told him one evening as we sat on my porch, sipping tea under the stars. We need to be sure this is right for all of us. Mark nodded, his gaze steady. I agree. But I also want you to know that whenever you're ready, I'm ready. His patience meant everything to me, and over the next few months, we continued to build the foundation of our renewed relationship. The day I finally asked Mark to come home was quiet and unassuming, much like the journey we'd been on. We were sitting at the kitchen table, planning the kids' schedules for the week, when I looked at him and said, I think it's time. He froze for a moment, his eyes searching mine as if to make sure he'd heard me correctly. You mean it? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. I mean it, I said, tears welling in my eyes. I want us to be a family again. The transition wasn't seamless, there were still moments of adjustment, of figuring out how to coexist in the same space after so much time apart. But there was also joy in the simple things, Mark helping the kids with their homework at the dining table, family movie nights on the couch, and lazy Sunday mornings spent making pancakes together. Each day felt like a step toward healing, a testament to the resilience of love and the power of second chances. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the kids play in the yard, Mark turned to me with a thoughtful expression. You know, he said, I don't think I've ever been as grateful for anything as I am for this, for you giving me another chance. I smiled, leaning my head against his shoulder. I don't think I've ever been as grateful for anything as I am for us finding our way back to each other. Mark's return home felt both familiar and foreign, like slipping on an old coat that had been mended and refitted for a new season. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of emotions, joy, relief, and the occasional pang of doubt. We'd come so far, but there was still a quiet voice in the back of my mind reminding me that this was only the beginning of the next chapter. The kids were ecstatic, their excitement filling the house in ways I hadn't heard in years. Our youngest clung to Mark every chance he got, while our daughter proudly declared, Daddy's home, so everything's better now. Her words warmed my heart, but they also underscored the weight of the responsibility we'd taken on, to make this work, not just for us but for them too. The routines we established were small but meaningful. Mark took over the morning school runs, a role he'd rarely had time for in the past, and the kids beamed with pride as he kissed them goodbye at the school gate. In the evenings, we cooked dinner together, a far cry from the days when he'd retreat to the couch with a drink while I managed the chaos on my own. We found joy in the mundane, whether it was folding laundry side by side or sitting on the porch after the kids were asleep, talking about everything and nothing. These moments, though simple, felt like proof that we were moving in the right direction. But rebuilding a marriage isn't just about the happy moments, it's about navigating the hard ones too. One night, after the kids were in bed, Mark and I had our first real argument since he'd moved back. It was about something small, a miscommunication about who was picking up the kids from a friend's house, but it quickly spiraled into a rehashing of old grievances. You don't trust me, he said, his voice tinged with frustration. Every time I make a mistake, it's like you're waiting for me to fail. His words stung because there was truth in them. I'm not waiting for you to fail, I said quietly. I'm just scared. Scared that this is too good to be true. Mark sighed, his shoulders slumping as the tension drained from his body. I get that, he said, his tone softer now. And I know I have to earn your trust back. But I can't do that if you don't let me. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was enough to remind me that we were in this together, flaws and all. The months that followed were a mix of growth and adjustment. We celebrated small milestones, like the day Mark hit 1 year of sobriety, and we navigated challenges, like helping our son through a tough time at school. Through it all, Mark remained steadfast, showing up for our family in ways that reminded me of why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. One evening, as we sat around the dining table playing a board game, our daughter looked up and said, "This is my favorite kind of day, when we're all together." Her words hit me like a bolt of lightning, a reminder of how far we'd come and how much we'd fought for this moment. After the kids were asleep, I found Mark on the porch, staring out at the stars. "What are you thinking about?" I asked, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders and sitting beside him. He turned to me, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and determination. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am," he said. "To have this, to have you. I don't take it for granted, not for a second." I leaned my head against his shoulder, a sense of peace washing over me. For the first time in years, I felt like we weren't just surviving, we were thriving. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was real. And that was enough. As the months rolled on, life began to settle into a rhythm that felt strangely natural, as though the years of tension and separation had melted into something more stable and real. Mark and I worked hard to navigate the intricacies of rebuilding not just our relationship, but our family as a whole. There were moments of doubt, of course, fleeting thoughts that reminded me how fragile trust can be, but they were overshadowed by the steady progress we were making. The kids flourished under the consistency of having both parents present. Our oldest, who had once withdrawn into himself, now came to Mark with his problems, and our daughter was inseparable from her dad, following him around the house with a giggle that filled every corner. One weekend, we decided to tackle a project that had long been neglected, the backyard. Over the years, it had become overgrown and wild, a forgotten space that mirrored the chaos our lives had once been. Together, we spent hours clearing weeds, planting flowers, and even building a small wooden swing for the kids. By the time the sun set, the yard had transformed into a haven, and as we stood back to admire our work, Mark wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "It's like a fresh start," he said, his voice low but full of meaning. "For all of us." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle into my heart. But even as we made strides forward, there were challenges that reminded us of how far we'd come. One evening, Mark had a particularly tough day at work. When he came home, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the frustration in his expression. In the past, this might have been the kind of evening that ended with a fight or a bottle in his hand, but instead, he sat down and told me about it. "I'm not used to doing this," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "Talking about how I feel instead of trying to drown it out." I placed a hand over his and said, "You're doing great, Mark. One day at a time." Those words, "one day at a time," became something of a mantra for us. It was a reminder that we didn't have to have everything figured out, that it was okay to take things slowly and let the pieces fall into place. As we approached the one-year anniversary of Mark moving back in, I realized just how much we had accomplished. It wasn't just the big things, like Mark's sobriety or the way the kids' eyes lit up when they talked about him, it was the little things, like the way he remembered my favorite tea or the way he always made time to tuck the kids in at night, no matter how tired he was. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching an old movie, Mark turned to me and said, "Do you ever think about renewing our vows?" The question took me by surprise, but as I thought about it, I realized how much the idea resonated with me. "I do," I said, smiling. "But only if we write new ones, ones that reflect who we are now, not who we were then." Mark nodded, a soft smile spreading across his face. "Deal." Planning the vow renewal became a family affair. The kids were ecstatic, especially our daughter, who immediately declared herself in charge of picking out the flowers. We decided on a simple ceremony in our backyard, the same space we transformed together. As the day approached, I found myself reflecting on the journey we'd been on, the heartbreak, the growth, the countless moments that had brought us to this point. The ceremony itself was small but perfect. As we stood under the archway of flowers, surrounded by family and close friends, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Mark's vows were simple but heartfelt, and as he spoke, I saw tears glistening in his eyes. "Laura," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in it, "I promise to keep choosing you, every single day. To keep growing, to keep showing up, and to never take this second chance for granted." When it was my turn, I took a deep breath and said, "Mark, we've been through more than I ever thought we could survive. But standing here with you today, I know that everything we've faced has brought us to this moment. I promise to love you, to trust you, and to build a future with you, one day at a time." As we exchanged rings and sealed our vows with a kiss, the kids erupted into cheers, their laughter filling the air like music. Later, as we danced under the string lights that crisscrossed the backyard, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. We weren't perfect, and we never would be, but we were stronger, more united, and more grateful for each other than ever before.